Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's online panel event, Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Debates, Legacies and New Directions for Research. I'm Emma Griffin, and I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and it's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you from so many corners of the globe to this afternoon's event. Do carry on putting where you're based in the chat if you're interested to do so. We have a truly wonderful panel, and it is such a pleasure to introduce all of our speakers. So first up is our chair, Matthew J. Smith. Matthew is a professor of history and director of the Centre for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery at UCL, University College London. His research is pan-Caribbean in scope, with special interest in the 19th and 20th centuries of Haiti and Jamaica. He has published a very large number of books on the Caribbean and has held several major research grants, fellowships, and visiting professorships, including at Williams College, Duke University, University of Michigan, and the University of Florida. Joining him today is Dr. Heather Cateau. Heather is Senior Lecturer in History at the University of the West Indies. She too is the author of numerous books and essays looking at the plantation systems and comparative systems of enslavement in Caribbean history. She is a past president of the Association of Caribbean Historians and a current member of their executive committee. This year, Heather is a Senior Research Fellow in the History Department at the University of St Andrews, working on the shared island stories between Scotland and the Caribbean project. With her is Dr. Stephen Mullen, also based in Scotland. He is a Research Associate in History at the University of Glasgow. He researches Scotland and Atlantic slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. And he's recently published his first book with the RHS in our Open Access series, New Historical Perspectives. His book is The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, Scotland and Caribbean Slavery, 1775 to 1838. We'll put the link to his wonderful book in the chat. We also have Professor Harvey R. Neptune. He's a professor of history at Temple University, Philadelphia. He specializes in post-emancipation history of the Caribbean. He published Caliban and the Yankees, Trinidad and the United States Occupation in 2007. He's currently pursuing research on the early history of petroleum in the Circum-Caribbean in a project designed to push Caribbean historiography beyond the plantation. And Professor Meleisa Ono-George makes up our panel. She has been Associate Professor and Brittenden Fellow in Black British History at the Queen's College, University of Oxford since 2021. Her research focuses on Black women's history in Britain and the Anglo-Caribbean. She is currently developing a community-engaged project which looks at the history of Black mothering in Britain and the use of creative storytelling. It's particularly lovely to welcome Meleisa here because she was a member of the Royal Historical Society's Race, Ethnicity and Equality Working Group, which helped to author our very successful and important Race, Ethnicity and Equality in UK History, a report and resource for change. Before I hand over, I'd just like to let you know that in addition to the chat, we have a Q&A icon down here at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to pose questions to the panel, you are very welcome to do so. We'll take a short break after around an hour, but you can use the Q&A anytime during the presentations to put questions to the panel, which Matt will host in the second half of the event. Over to you then, Matt.
Thank you very much, Emma, and greetings everyone, wherever in the world you're joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here with us on this discussion today. Trinidadian Eric Williams might very well be the most recognizable name in English language history writing on the Caribbean. If not, he definitely should be. Williams was a principal inaugurator then of an entirely new way of seeing modern British history and its relationship to its one-time colonists in the Americas. The generation that came after him might have quarreled loudly with him in print, but they shared with Williams a determined focus to pull the history of the Caribbean, based as it was on racial slavery and colonialism, from the summary chapters of imperial histories to having a far more central role in the shaping of the modern world. Williams was as much a history maker as a historian. After leaving the profession in the 1950s, as he put it succinctly in his autobiography, Inward Hunger, he, quote, crossed the Rubicon and entered politics. In 1956, as founder and leader of the People's National Movement, the PNM, he was elected Premier, later Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, carrying his nation to independence in August 1962. His remarkable career was highlighted by incredible milestones, the greatest of which was his continued leadership as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago through the turbulent 60s and 70s until his death in March 1981. It was a peerless path for a man who first came to notice in Britain when he arrived as a bright scholarship student at Oxford University in the 1930s to read for a degree in history. His career as historian was launched at a time when there were incredibly few Caribbean persons in UK universities. The history of the Caribbean itself had not been written or about or taught much here in Britain or there in the Caribbean. Williams famously jibed that his early education was more suited for Portsmouth than Port of Spain. He involved himself in the mission to correct this, and out of that dedication came his seminal book, Capitalism and Slavery. Based on his Oxford DPhil, it was revised and published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1944. It has been seldom out of print since then. Prefiguring some of the newer histories of capital and British industry, Capitalism and Slavery has been a tremendous, though not unimpeachable, career. 8 decades on, it continued to find new audiences seeking to learn as much about its main subjects, slavery, empire, emancipation, capital, industrialization, as the motivations and contributions of the man who wrote it. These are indeed some of the concerns that we'll pick up today on this panel. Joining me is an esteemed group of historians who have, in their own work and historical practice, had to consider the import of capitalism and slavery and its great legacy. Heather, Stephen, Harvey, and Meleisa. Stephen, I want to start with you. For at least 7 generations of historians working on slavery and the Caribbean, it is almost impossible for us to think of our world without the presence of capitalism and slavery. Yet there was a time when it didn't exist, and in fact may not have even found a British readership. Could you say something about the origins of the book and its journey to publication?
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. For Capitalism and Slavery, of course, it began as a doctoral study at the University of Oxford in December 1938. Williams defended his thesis, which was titled The Economic Aspect of the Abolition of the West Indian Slave Trade and Slavery, which incidentally has also just been republished. The thesis presents a similar argument to Capitalism and Slavery, but it's a different work altogether. Like many thesis to monograph projects, there was a delay in publishing, but Williams faced challenges in British universities that were unique to scholars from the British colonies. Williams, of course, he couldn't secure a post in England, which he attributed to racism, recounting in his autobiography, Inward Hunger, how senior people at Oxford had told him to go home because he would be taking a job from Englishmen. So in 1939, he of course goes to Howard University in the USA, which allowed him for more ambitious research, which becomes his first book, The Negro in the Caribbean, 1942. So he's established that even at this point, Britain's most radical publisher, Warburg, wouldn't publish his thesis, simply because Williams argued that the slave trade and plantation slavery were abolished for economic reasons rather than humanitarian. And of course, this struck at the ideological core of the then orthodoxies around the British Empire's supposed benevolence. But as you mentioned, it was published in 1944 by the University of North Carolina Press, another edition, 61 and 67, with Russell and Russell, paperback by Capcom Books. And we know it first appeared in England with André Deutsch in 1964. And of course, it's been republished in many languages in different formats, including Penguin, Modern Classics last year.
Yes, and it's important you said that, Stephen, that it had a 1964 publication 20 years after its first appearance. And then we had another Penguin edition of it, which just came out last year. The fundamental thing, though, which you hit on very well, I thought, was the fact that Williams was departing from a sort of historiographical orthodoxy around the question about the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and eventually slavery itself. This has often been referred to as a Williams thesis. Heather, I wonder if you could help us define what the Williams thesis is.
Sure, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I would start by saying that William, on one level, is telling a very simple story. He's telling a story starting from the reasons for the origins of enslavement. He goes on to talking about why it was entrenched. And of course, he deals with why it declines and why the system ends. But the thesis evolved from the fact that he asked 3 essential questions. What really was behind the origins of the system? What led to this profitability? and the impact of this profitability, and why did it end? And out of this, we have the Williams theses. There are three. Enslavement originated because of economic factors. The second one, the system was profitable, so profitable that Williams went so far as to say that it led to the British Industrial Revolution. And the third one, the system ended because it was no longer profitable, not because of humanitarianism. Sometimes described as economic determinism, but Williams is really dealing with a structure. And he is saying it's a structure, an economic infrastructure that is influencing what is going on in the society and what is connecting these colonies to Britain. And that, in a nutshell, is the Williams thesis. It is extremely significant because it was a total reversal of what had been accepted up to that point.
I wonder, Heather, if we could just sort of expand on that a bit. I mean, Williams' radical departure, as you put it, with this thesis that we find in the book, was shaped at a very important time. I mean, coming from Trinidad to Britain in the 1930s, there's much going on back home, but also much going on here. I wonder if you could highlight some of the influences, as you see, that might have inspired Williams to go in this direction with the development of this thesis.
Well, that was part of the problem. Williams was actually, if we think about that time period, we're talking about a period of decolonization that is coming to the forefront. There's the growth of the independence movement. The Second World War is just finished. People are beginning to look inward and what shall I say, theories about the world of external, of the world of trade in external development, those things are being queried. In this environment, Williams had the audacity to suggest that a controversial topic or issue like enslavement was responsible for the development in Britain, and to actually connect this to the royal family and to the man in the street and to the Industrial Revolution. So in this context of what was going on in the world and the issues that were buzzing in colonies and in the mother country, it was a very controversial time. And that was one of the reasons why the work had such an impact. So it's very significant, the role this book played in the whole decolonization movement and the movement towards independence in the Caribbean region, and a change in that relationship between the colonies and Britain.
Yes, and that's found very, very profoundly, I think, in the language of the book. There's a real sort of courage in his prose. And Stephen mentioned his early publication, Negro in the Caribbean. And if one read that, and in conjunction with some of the articles he published just before Capitalism and Slavery came out, you can see the building up of that. You can see a very sort of, a certain vibrancy in the prose that's a sort of unafraid to express and connect the present he was living in with the late 18th century into the 19th century history of the British Empire. Harvey, Williams, when he arrives in Britain, and as we mentioned, arrived on a scholarship. He arrived to form himself as an intellectual, but he comes out of a tradition of intellectualism in the British Caribbean at the time that had reached a certain acuteness, one would say, if you think about C.L.R. James, who was working on his Black Jacobins at the same time in the 1930s, and the long debates around labor and decolonization that Heather just mentioned. I wonder if you could say something about the way in which that intellectual tradition shaped Williams, and maybe something as well about how capitalism and slavery in turn shaped that tradition after. Harvey?
Unmute. Yeah, I want to thank the Royal Historical Society, Matt, and everyone for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And I want to take up maybe a bit on what Heather was saying, because I think the 1930s is a really important context for thinking about the book, right? The book comes out in 44, but as Stephen said, the dissertation is 1938. And maybe I'll do something a little bit different than what I've done in my published work on Williams, because there's a way that the essay that I've written on Williams kind of makes him into a bit of a great man of history, in a sense, right? It's Williams the Conqueror, right, as Farrell called him. But here, what I would want to stress in this time is the way Williams is a product of the 1930s. And while he might be the sharpest expression of it, in some ways the most articulate expression, I think it's important to see that Williams is not quite inventing the wheel and making this argument, right? So as you said, we know he's borrowing a big part of his thesis from C.L.R. James. Anyone who reads Black Jacobins, I can't remember the page, but somewhere there on page 53 or something, right? James makes a point about the reasons for abolition, and Williams takes that up and extends it into an entire book. But maybe more importantly, if you look at the Beacon, a magazine that's published in Trinidad in the early 1930s, like you read the Beacon around 1932 and 1933, you will find statements similar to Williams' theses being made by activists and nationalists. So there's a way that when Williams leaves in 1932, he's carrying arguments and ideas and a certain intellectual imagination that's part of the local scene. And in some ways, I'd argue even part of the wider Caribbean scene. I think you know well about Haiti, but Cuba, there are similar kind of debates. Ortiz is a product of that period as well. And maybe one specific thing I'd say that should help us understand Williams and the argument is that in 1933, it's the centenary of emancipation, right? And it's not, emancipation isn't celebrated. That's something that people should know, right? It's Wilberforce that's celebrated. And so if we think about people in Trinidad celebrating Wilberforce in this era of decolonization, right, then we can see like what the politics of Williams's argument is. Right, so that's the thing I'd really want to stress. Williams is brilliant, he's a genius, but as I argue in my book, Caliban and the Yankees, Williams should be seen as an expression. So I really want to make that point, because if people just read the article, they would think, oh my gosh, Harvey's just so in love with Williams. Yeah, but there's so much mythologizing around Williams that I also wanted to make the case that Williams is an expression of politics that's happening locally.
Well, that's it. That's important. Thanks for that, Harvey. It's a good intervention. But it does lead me to think about Williams' own sort of his intention as a Caribbean historian entering this field with this DPhil, and then later on when it becomes a book. You know, it is an expression, as you say, perhaps of a wider generational impulse at the time in the Caribbean. But it's also clearly charting a very, very new way of representing that history in print. And I wonder if you could say something more about that, because that's something that would take him not only to Britain, but then eventually to the United States afterwards, where he would publish the book.
Yeah, so maybe in that way, and maybe it's the changing the geography in a sense of his argument. So if his argument isn't necessarily novel for the Caribbean context, it's definitely fresh and original for the British context, right? And this is part of what's so bold about Williams's argument, right? Because he's arguing against Reginald Coupland, right? So in the British context, the person who has been writing about abolition and end of slavery is Coupland. And Coupland, if I have right, was an examiner, right, on his thesis committee. And so in terms of British intellectual history, I think it's seriously challenging that tradition. And that tradition itself maybe should be described more accurately as Anglo-Atlantic, because even within the US, you have people like Frank Klingberg, who's writing, even Carter G. Woodson, you read him in the 1930s, he's citing Coupland, right? So in this, I mean, again, it's a really bold anti-colonial argument, and Williams decides like he's hitting at the main player, Coupland. So I think to answer your question in a brief way, I think it's the departure that it represents is a departure from the dominant Anglo-Atlantic tradition.
Yeah, Great. And that again connects very well to the idea of the context, because we're moving from the 30s into the 40s, and much is happening in the African American world in the United States. Much is happening in the movement towards decolonization and first self-government in the British Islands of the Caribbean, as well as news of what's happening in other parts of the Americas, Haiti, Cuba, and so forth. Which means that when the book is published, the sort of way in which the book is received by these various spaces and audiences is quite different. I wonder if we could think about that for a bit, because the famous story of the publication of Capitalism and Slavery is that, if I'm correct, that Williams had to find some money to put up a subvention for its appearance as well, and University of North Carolina, once that was guaranteed, was willing to publish it. But what happened when the book was actually released, and what sort of presence did it have in these various spaces? And I wonder if Meleisa and Stephen might start us off in thinking about the book's reception in Britain. Not only, well, we know it took 20 years before its first publication, but also the sort of presence it had in conversations about slavery and freedom.
Meleisa first.
Yeah, Meleisa.
So, I mean, I don't think I have much to say about its reception in Britain. Actually, Stephen, I feel like this might be a better question for you to start with.
Yeah, I can certainly talk about the Scottish debate in it. That would be my specialism. Well, I think, the Williams thesis in industrialisation, that slavery and its commerce was central to the progress in time, and it's been long debated in an English context. I think with a narrow focus at the start, focusing on the African, the maritime traffic in the African people. And I think that's one reason why Scotland was sort of sidestepped, because Scotland has got limited direct role in triangular trade. But what we're seeing really in more modern historiography, there's an understanding that Scotland was directly influenced by the Atlantic trades. And we're really seeing this from the 2000s onwards. I should say the work of historian Tom Devine had been arguing from the 1970s that colonial merchant capital and the Atlantic trades were fundamentally Scotland, but Devine ignored the significance of chattel slavery as the foundation of Scotland's commercial and industrial revolutions. After 2000, there's been a complete imperial reckoning in Scottish historiography. There has been a number of game changers. Joseph Inakuri's work in 2002, Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England, that's underlining by proxy Scotland's Industrial Revolution. It was Anglo-centric, but it's stimulating Scottish work. Douglas Hamilton's book in 2005, Scotland, the Caribbean, is positively citing Williams. He's the first to do so. Since the 1970s, one citation. And then thirdly, the work of Nick Draper in particular on Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project. This is presiding from 2010, the representative foundation and the unambiguous evidence that Scots are disproportionately overrepresented in Caribbean slave ownership. So it's now generally accepted, the historiography, including ironically the work of Devine, recovering Scotland's slavery past. Scotland's got a smaller and less diversified economy than England, but its industrial revolution is progressing quicker at a time its connections with the Caribbean in particular, but also North America, are inextricably connected. So in two works in the last 2 years, my own and David Alston, were interrogating the Williams thesis in new ways.
Great, thank you for that, Stephen. And as you mentioned, the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project definitely took a lot of a sort of the intellectual framing of the questions that it asked was based very heavily on the I would say the Williams debate, as well as capitalism and slavery itself. Heather, I wonder if you could say something about the presence of the Williams, the book and Williams' arguments in the Caribbean. How is it sort of regarded and sort of received and lives there in the Caribbean?
Well, I think I really have to start by saying that I grew up with the Capitalism and Slavery in the house. People bought the book. I grew up with stories about Williams. My parents and my grandparents would have gone to hear him talk. So he very much has a Caribbean presence which transcends generations. And many of us can still remember that book sitting on that shelf. Now, when the book was published, and I totally agree with Harvey, if we want to trace a Caribbean thought in abolitionist history, we go back to CLR, who was who was Williams' mentor. But it is Williams' version in Capitalism and Slavery that really got the attention. And what we see after that is people taking very strong perspectives on one side or the other. And this went on, I would say, from about the 1960s to the 1980s. And I think for the Caribbean, we are also part of that story, because we have our own theorists, for example, Selwyn Carrington, we have Hilary Beckles, we have a response from the Caribbean to that movement. And I think it's a very exciting period, not just in terms of what should I say, in terms of developments in the Caribbean, but also our academics and getting involved in this William debate. And I think that has influenced us a lot. I remember using Capitalism and Slavery in sixth form. From that early age, it became representative of a Caribbean perspective, a Caribbean viewpoint. And I think that has grown straight up now that we have courses dealing with capitalism at the University of the West Indies. So I think in a sense, the book was part of that fight for decolonization, for independence in the Caribbean region. Everyone didn't greet him. William was a politician. There was that side which influenced the way in which the work was accepted. So there was support. There was also very strong feeling against Williams. But I think as we look at the development of our region and as a nationhood, not only Williams, but capitalism and slavery itself can be shown to play a very important role and to also reflect our development as a nation.
Yes, thanks for that. I remember myself, Heather, being an undergraduate, and there was that course that we had at university called Capitalism and Slavery, and the whole course was on the book and its arguments, and its presence in Jamaica was very strong on reading lists. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the book, in addition to what we've already said, inaugurated a tradition of Caribbean history writing by Caribbeans. And I think in many ways that elevated the esteem with which it was regarded in the region. But a lot of the debate around the book we found in the United States. That's where you began to see some of the most prominent historians taking issue with Williams' claims in the book. I wonder if Harvey and Meleisa, if you could say something about the sorts of contentions with the Williams thesis that we find in historiography, particularly in North America. Meleisa?
So sorry, Matthew, I can speak about British history a little bit more, I think, than the North American context. And I mean, it's amazing how much this is still a debate, I think, in British history, and how reluctant actually people still are to even having Williams on sort of reading lists that are focused on British history or modern British history. So it's fine, I think, when it comes to studies on Caribbean history. Of course, you're going to have it on the reading list. Or if you have something, you're teaching a course on Black British history, of course you have sort of capitalism and slavery. But in terms of courses on just modern British history, I think there's still a reluctance, and I think that is partially because there is still a reluctance to see the Caribbean and the parts of the empire as an intrinsic part of British history, and that I think that is still a very contentious thing, particularly in institutions like this one, like Oxford, for instance, where the reading lists are quite set. But again, like just in terms of what Harvey was saying, what Heather was saying as well, I mean, I was trying to think before about when I first read Capitalism and Slavery, and really it was a part of a Caribbean studies program at a university in Toronto. So it was sort of Caribbean scholars who were insistent that as an introduction, everybody reads people like Eric Williams and C.L.R. James and Franz Fanon and some of the Caribbean writers. And so for me, it's been so intrinsic in the ways in which I look at British history. It's hard to sort of separate that out.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Meleisa. Harvey, do you remember when you first read the book?
Yeah, I do. But even before, I want to say something about the reception in the US, if only because one of the more authoritative historians, Gerald Horne, wrote this review, and he talked about like the immediate criticism, the fandom and the critique. And actually, one of the things I want to say about the reception of the book, and Heather hinted at it in her timeline, is that for about 2 decades, the book was kind of ignored. And I think it's important to say that, especially for people who write stuff and think no one cares about it, right? So for 2 decades, Williams was kind of ignored. So the idea of a Williams thesis and a Williams debate is really a late 1960s and especially a 1970s phenomenon. On one hand, I'll take back half of that. That's mostly true among white academics. Typical of the United States, there's a kind of segregated response. Even Woodson, right, who was quoting Coupland in the 30s, is the one who's busy publishing Williams's essays in the Journal of Negro History in the 40s, and then people like Oliver Cox, E. Franklin Frazier. So a lot of the Black academics and Black intellectuals are citing Williams, but the mainstream, the white mainstream historians in the US, they aren't citing Williams. Like in the article that I wrote, I talk about the fact that someone like David Bryan Davis isn't familiar with Capitalism and Slavery in the 1950s. Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black does not cite Capitalism and Slavery, 1968. Neither does it cite C.L.R. James. So there's a politics of reception there that I think is really important for us to consider, right? This book is kind of ahead of its time, but the reception, the debate is somewhat late. My own encounter, unlike Heather, I guess I didn't grow up in such like an intellectual or political household. There was no Capitalism and Slavery in my house. I first read the book when I moved to the US and it was in grad school. And I remember really well, it was Connie Sutton's Caribbean anthropology class, RIP Connie Sutton. And I feel I actually read it in 2 classes in the same semester, Jeffrey Salmons at NYU. And I was blown away, of course, by and I have to say, mostly by the literary qualities that you talked about, Matt, like his voice and wit and just the like tidiness of the argument. It was, anyway, I could go on, so let me stop.
No, thank you for that, Harvey. I think the point about the way in which the book found a presence on reading lists that were about the Caribbean, whether in the Caribbean or when more and more of those courses emerged in North America, is very, very important. It says a lot about the way in which the book is sort of always held as a foundation stone on which you begin to think about the Caribbean quite differently. But I wonder, Stephen, your personal views, just sticking with this theme briefly, when your own encounter with the book in Scotland, when do you recall when that was and its effect?
Yeah,
on
I
you?
do. It was 2007. So I was involved in a project looking at Glasgow streets with connections to slavery. It was 2 years after I did a history degree at the University of Strathclyde, which is in an area called the Merchant City in Glasgow. I had went through that degree without reading Capitalism and Slavery or having an appreciation of Glasgow's full role in Atlantic slavery. So I remember the year, and I actually remember being fairly disappointed in the book because I completely underestimated and or I never appreciated the power of argument. I was looking for information about Glasgow and Scotland and thinking it had relatively little. The irony is that actually by centering Glasgow as a great British seaport, then Williams he's provided the key to understand the development of Glasgow and modern Scotland.
Yeah, wow, thank you. Can we shift back slightly now to some of the arguments of the book? And I think some of that do need a little bit more discussion here. Harvey, you mentioned that the first sorts of grappling, if you will, with the book really starts to emerge around the 60s and the 70s, and you you mentioned the sort of, US historians in particular, those who had ignored him, but then you begin to get a generation that take him up, Seymour Drescher and others. I wonder if you could say something about the sort of counter argument to Williams that emerged, and what sort of effect did that have on how the book would have sort of relevance as we move into that post-independence period in the Caribbean?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll talk about the most effective, almost consequential kind of criticisms of it. And I would say we'd have to turn to like David Bryan Davis, who writes what I think it's The Problem of Slavery in the Western World. I think that's like 67 or something. And he takes on the book there, and he's really extended a critical tradition that we could find in Frank Tannenbaum, his review in 1947. And I think why it's also so effective is because in a way they pushed at what Williams they pushed at the most troubling kind of political point of his argument, especially his argument about abolition, right? And at the core of it was morals, right? What Williams is really trying to do is demoralize the argument about abolition. This wasn't about the goodness of British people, right? This was about economics. But people like Frank Tannenbaum, David Bryan Davis, like they really wanted morals at the center of this story. And I think it has to do with a larger commitment in the Cold War. I think we shouldn't leave the Cold War out of this story at all, right? A larger commitment in the context of the Cold War to identify the West with like a certain morality. And in that way, I think Davis especially, right, because he wins the awards and he's a great historian, persuasive writer, I think his critique of Williams ended up being really central and kind of, I wouldn't say repressing it, but in terms of making it a less visible contribution. Like people would just cite Davis and then feel they don't have to read Williams. And at the core of it, again, was this question of morals. It wasn't, I wouldn't say he didn't overcome Williams based so much on evidence. It was almost like a philosophical argument. It was like morals must come. Like you can't take away morals from this story. It's kind of an ideological argument, I would say.
Yeah. And then we get to a point where there's much more interest in studying economic histories of the 19th century, which leads to new methodologies of studying the economic histories of enslaved societies. And that's where Seymour Drescher's work, which is a monograph length critique, if you will, of Williams by introducing very, very important new research. I wonder, Stephen, if you want to say something about some of those, very established new directions that evolved from this debate.
Yeah, well, I can certainly speak about how I approached that, on the monograph that I evolved for a doctorate at the University of Glasgow in 2010. So I started out with the hypothesis that Caribbean slavery was central to the development of Glasgow and modern Scotland. And obviously the monograph is set post-American Revolution era, directly when Williams claims that, the West India economy was in decline. I think it's generally accepted that, he dated decline too early, 1776. And as Nicholas Draper notes, though, that being wrong about decline actually strengthens Williams' main thesis that slavery was central to the progress and time of the Industrial Revolution, simply because slavery in the Atlantic or the West India economy was vibrant across the classical years of the Industrial Revolution, right up to 1830. So I think, I set about, just tackling these issues in Scotland. I looked at imports and export ledgers, underlining that the West India economy was central to the Scottish economy into the 1820s. Then I tried an innovative approach, really assessing the scale of significance of Atlantic trades in West India fortunes, both in Glasgow, the mercantile fortunes, as well as the colonial fortunes, taking them in a single analytical frame and really facilitating a comparison between my three islands that I chose, Jamaica, Grenada, and Trinidad in Scotland in the late 18th and 19th century. I should say that I think the idiosyncrasies of Scots law facilitated a new assessment, because it seems to me that the legal recording around probate is much more comprehensive in Scotland. So we're getting very many of these West India merchants, as well as Scots that have been in the colonies, and their wealth is recorded in the commissary and sheriff courts of Scotland in a way that just simply doesn't exist for the respective English practices. So I think, I mean, I'm arguing, effectively that I'm looking at the importance of the West India trades, the importance of mercantile capital, the importance of return sojourning capital, and I'm arguing that Caribbean slavery and its commerce had the greatest effects in Glasgow and its hinterlands when compared to other British Atlantic ports, of course, Bristol, London and Liverpool. It's absolutely central to the development of Glasgow in particular, and Scotland more broadly. And these processes are pulling in large swathes of Scottish society into Scotland's Atlantic slavery economy. And this is, with the assistance of the Scottish legal records, I think this is a comparative methodology, a regional development that's also replicable.
Thank you, Stephen. I think for the benefit of the audience, we should mention that we're discussing here your book, Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy. And I think we'll put a link in the chat for audience members to find it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heather, in the Caribbean, with the development of new methodologies and new different sorts of research questions on how to understand the history of enslavement in the region, is there a way in which Williams' work has been overturned, modified, or challenged?
I don't think so. I think Williams's work is very much a work of its times, but I think it has withstood the test of time. I think there were very strong views. In addition to the authors discussed already, I want us to remember that profitability debate was really attacked. We have people like Robert Thomas saying that there were no profits, Ingerman saying small profits. And for a time, it seems as if the very profitability of the system was being questioned. But Williams withstood the test of time. Even the decline debate with Drescher, well, in that one, I much mentioned Selwyn Carrington, who was my supervisor, who led the flag against Drescher, insisting and doing his own work, showing that connection. And I think even at this point, although that may be the most controversial era, I still firmly believe that the second half of the 18th century, there's a totally different context in the Caribbean. Whether we want to call it decline, whether we want to talk about relativity, it's a different organizational environment. But I would say from the Caribbean perspective that many people began to look at aspects of Williams' work. I could include my own work, which looked at the management of sugar plantations. Many students, graduate students, looking at different dimensions and aspects of the thesis from a Caribbean perspective. So there is that growth of scholarship. I would also want to add, though, that I think over time, sentiments shift again. And I do believe that by the time we get to the end of the 18th century and by the time we get to the end of the 20th century and the onset of the 21st century, I think there's a resurgence. I think there is new and innovative work that transforms the whole field yet again. And Stephen, I include your work in that. I think we are at the stage with capitalism and slavery where it's entering yet another phase in terms of its importance and its relativity. So I see Capitalism and Slavery, the book published 1944-2023, going through different phases, influenced a lot by what is going on in the outside world at that point in time, but certainly withstanding the test of time. I'm not saying it's a perfect book. But I still believe the fundamental arguments in Williams are strong. I have not been convinced. I think they have been important work, which I value, shedding new insight and more detail. But still, I think the fundamental aspects of Williams' thesis are alive and well, or theses, I should say, in 2023.
Thank you. One of the things that we do know more and more about, as you mentioned, some of the new historiography, is how we understand development of non-sugar commodities in this period. And a lot of that new historiography is using frameworks quite similar to Williams in Capitalism and Slavery. Harvey, I know you've written about the way in which some of this is evolving in a direction that doesn't necessarily link back very clearly to capitalism and slavery. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, maybe I have a little bit to say about that, but do you mind if I kind of pose a question back to the panel, sort of? Because it has to do with the profitability question. By my reading of Williams, right, and I'm thinking of Drescher's Econocide, right, by saying it wasn't unprofitable at the moment, right, that plantation slavery wasn't unprofitable, and therefore abolition was like suicidal, so he calls it Econocide, right? I wonder if the panel agrees that Williams is actually saying that, okay, let me frame it another way. Is he saying that slavery is unprofitable, or is the bigger argument really about the new place of slavery within a larger British imperial economy? Like, it's almost like by my reading of the book, the debate about profitability is kind of overstated. Like, I don't think it's for him, it's about numbers. It's about a new liberal political economy, right? Liberal capitalism that's replacing mercantilism. And within that new framework, the Caribbean just becomes less significant. I don't know if that question is made, but it's like a new paradigm. So it's not so much about looking for the numbers, but there's a new paradigm in which the place of West Indian slavery is different, right? Monopolies being replaced by free trade. So I don't know what people, if my reading is a little bit off there.
Sure, I saw Stephen nodding there. Would you like to come in here, Stephen?
Yeah, it could be, but I would also think, I mean, it's easier to answer that with numbers. So that tends to be the numbers game. So I accept it's reductive, but I mean, that's the way it's happened. I should say I don't see myself as an economic historian. I started off as a social historian, but I've been pulled into the numbers game, and then it's been easier to do that in Scotland with the different records. But I mean, that's an interesting argument by Harvey, absolutely. And I think possibly true, you know, the West Indies are, and there are different ways to look at decline.
Yeah. Okay, so Matt, I'll try to quickly.
I want to make a comment about that. I want to and I'm not cheating here, but I do think both dimensions are true, which is what makes Williams so complex and so difficult. On one level, he is dealing with profitability. He's calling numbers and figures and people, and so on a very practical level, he's interested in a figure. And he is saying, you people in the Caribbean, you all contributed money, etc., to this world that we see out there that you all are not a part of. So I think that is important. I agree with the part about the numbers game and going too far, and sometimes we forget about the meaning behind the numbers. But you are very right. In terms of the other dimension, Williams is saying, and you get this if you read his conclusion, that this is a structural thing that we need to understand. It's about societal change. It's about how societies move from one form of economic base to another form. Right. And that is really what he is trying to say. And so I think it's two. And the latter may be more powerful, and it is oftentimes missed. I keep saying Williams' conclusion is not what we expect from the content of his book. And that's because I think of two things that he's doing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Meleisa, do you have a thought here?
I mean, I think the point about the sort of not getting sort of too hung up on the numbers is actually really important. That actually the contribution that capitalism and slavery makes it goes way beyond that, I think. And I think that's why it's sort of stood the test of time, as Heather says, right? Like, I think it's because it's making an argument that is much bigger than the numbers, and that is still really quite radical in terms of British history and in terms of the history of slavery.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I would agree with that point. I think Williams was doing way more than just looking at sort of the economic history, and was using that as a point to discuss much bigger questions about the changes in British society, as well as the changes from one economic system, which he called in the book commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism. And I think it might be useful for audience members to be aware of some of his earlier writings before the book came out. He published a really good essay, which is in some senses a overview of the book called The Golden Age of British Slavery. And I think in some senses he's a bit bolder in that book, in that article, than in the book, and he makes a really strong point about the way in which people living in Britain in the 18th century couldn't say they were unaware of slavery because it was everywhere. And he goes into the whole system of iron making and the way in which capital circulated within British port towns and so on. And I think that kind of comes back to one of the themes that we've been hearing both from Heather and Harvey about this larger question looming in Williams' mind as he works on this, which is, where is the British Caribbean at that point in time? Is this sense of forgetting of the relevance of the Caribbean one in which he's pointing to the 19th century, but is he also thinking very clearly about the 1930s and 1940s? And you're absolutely right, Heather, the conclusion of the book, he is explicit about that. And interestingly, he has a line in the conclusion about historians can't think they will make history. They really don't. But then he goes on to be a history maker himself as a politician. But given all of that, though, there is an unmistakable critique that I think is worth mentioning, that there are aspects of enslaved societies in the Caribbean that are not given full treatment in the book and attention. And I wonder if anyone wants to sort of say something about that. What are areas of how we understand Caribbean slave societies today that are not necessarily picked up on or sort of overlooked by Williams in Capitalism and Slavery? Maybe we'll start with you, Meleisa, if you don't mind. I'm thinking of your own work in this field too.
Williams is not great on women. I feel like that's, he has, I don't know if he has anything to say about women's contribution as in, so that is not what you're going to find in there. And of course, there's been incredible work, sort of since the 70s, as we've seen Malcolm Mayer and Bryn Shepherd and Hilary Bickles, who've done incredible work on actually women's contribution to enslaved women's contributions, and actually for women as well, contributions to Caribbean economies. And so I think that's probably an obvious absence in his work. Yeah.
Heather?
I would say the James influence and what I call his undeveloped thesis, emancipation from below but emancipation, when he began to deal with the whole issue of the role of the resistance of the enslaved people in the process, that is very underdeveloped. And I think today we have done a lot more work about resistance. And I do believe that is an area that needs development. I still think we have not fully appreciated the role of enslaved resistance in ending enslavement. I think the region was not as stable as we often believe when you actually read the documents, the extent of the instability, the extent to which I believe the planters were not in full control. So I think that dimension of the work, and I think he sacrificed it for his economic determinism, but I still think we have to grapple with that if we are to truly understand that emancipation environment.
Yeah, which in retrospect is somewhat surprising given the close relationship to C.L.R. James, who at the time was writing his big book on the Haitian Revolution. Harvey, any thoughts from you on aspects of Caribbean slave society that Williams did not give sufficient attention to in the book?
No, I'll actually just echo Meleisa and Heather, and maybe add that Williams actually had no intention of writing about enslaved resistance, right? If you read the Colin Palmer prologue, like that is added really late. And I've heard it, I might have read somewhere that that was James's influence. So, you know, that he has nothing much to say about women or even slaves and resistance, like that wasn't really his interest, which is weird if you think about him becoming like, you know, this big politician after, right? That it's not, this wasn't about agency. I read some review where they said this book was about agency. That wasn't, I mean, he, in the introduction, the preface, he says something like, this book is primarily a contribution to English economic history. And I think we should take that seriously. The slave stuff is like an afterthought for him, which is a profound problem, but it's the book he was trying to write.
Stephen?
I think, well, the obvious for a historian of Scotland's point of view is Williams was Anglo-centric. He conflated England with Great Britain and Scotland, even though he was ahead of his time and including Glasgow in a British Atlantic framework. What I would like to see was an extension of what he did do, which is the regional studies, you know, more local studies about the impact across British cities. He does a bit in Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow. We could extend that to local studies. Setting what he didn't do, he did a chapter in the West India, interesting. He looked a little at personal investments, but not really, and it's not really a major feature of his thesis. We know the LBS, Legacies of Slave Ownership project, has started that process, we know, but to me, this is the bigger key. It's local studies across the UK, you know, these personal fortunes, where did they go into churches, did they go into banks, schools, universities? The process has already started. And I think over the next 10 years, you know, we'll see that in comparative framework. Money repatriated from the West Indies as well as North America and the influences in the UK. And also Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, you know, there's a full Four Nations context.
Yeah. In some ways, I think it might be fair to say to Eric Williams, giving credit after this very fruitful discussion of the absences in the book, that it opened up a space through which a lot of these other questions which hadn't been posed or even conceived of before could actually emerge. And in addition to the questions about the economic value, if you will, of the colonies and sugar and coffee to the British Empire at the time, there are also questions, coming back to Melissa's point, about the societies and how the societies were composed. And you know, you had very, very shortly after this book appeared, you had Elsa Gavai, the Guyanese historian, just 4 years later, submitting her PhD dissertation, or entering the PhD program, I should say. The dissertation was submitted in the 1950s, in which she was saying that the economic argument should be now extended into a closer look at enslaved societies. So one could say that may not have been questions that would not have been posed in that particular way had capitalism and slavery not sort of shifted the tenor of the conversation. We're up on the 1 hour mark of this really, really fantastic conversation we've been having, and it may be appropriate now for us to take a very brief 3-minute break so that we can all sort of get some comfort before rejoining each other online. So let's take a brief 3-minute break, everyone. Thank you. We're back. Thank you for staying with us on this panel discussion. I'm seeing from the Q&A that we have several questions that members of our audience have been posing. I think it might be a good time to bring some of those questions into the conversation. There is a question, I'm going to try and this is for everyone who's listening. Please, if you have other questions, just put them in the Q&A. We will do our best to accommodate as many questions in the time remaining on today's panel. I'm going to start with a question that came, and I probably would put this to you, Heather, just to start us off. A question by Kathy on if you could make this into a college course, how would you go about it? You had mentioned earlier, Heather, that this was indeed a college course at one point. Could you just say very briefly how you'd structure a college course around capitalism and slavery?
I would say that in terms of the methodology, an approach, it should be as interactive as possible. I think Williams' work is so dynamic that it really allows for participation, teams, debates, as you deal with the different themes. I would suggest one, starting with an understanding of the man and his life and his times, which is so important. But I do think that sessions could be held around each of his major themes. I think you can also look at the undeveloped themes, for example, like the one we were just talking about. And certainly, I think the impact of his work and contemporary relevance allows you to bring that work straight up to our current times. So I think it's a lovely book to turn into a course. And I also will say, depending on where you are in our geographic global space, I think you can tailor it and create a special session that connects it to whether it's the Caribbean, whether you're in Britain, whether in US, the applicability of that to your particular context at that time. So I think there are many things that can be done. I encourage whoever it is to please do it. And contact me for any kind of further information, because we have certainly offered a course on capitalism and slavery for years. It has been a favorite. The students find it's different from what they usually do. And I would love it if someone else wants to continue along those lines.
Thanks very much, Heather. I was just listening to your response just now. I was struck by how a course on capitalism and slavery can itself evolve over generations. Because if one were to teach it now, it'd be very different from when I was an undergraduate at University of West Indies, Mona in Jamaica, and how it was taught then. And a lot of that has to do with, as you say, different ways in which we understand Eric Williams today, thanks to a lot of the new biographies that have emerged about Williams over the past 20 years, but also how we understand the arguments of the book, which are always shifting and changing, which in itself says a tremendous amount about its continued relevance in the 21st century. Before I go to the next question, and I wonder if anybody on the panel might know the answer to this. I'm searching for it in my own mind. Did Williams himself ever respond in defense of the book when he became Prime Minister? And did he ever return to it in any extended way? No. I see Harvey shaking his head. Harvey?
Not that I know of. I've actually looked for it, and it's one of the things I kind of love about him that way. It's like, let the debate happen. It's like, I said what I said. You all can argue about it.
Yeah, he just dropped the mic and then
yeah.
Good.
I agree, but I would also, I think he intended to drop the mic. That was
yeah. But just to jump into the teaching question, I taught a grad course on it, and it was a really fruitful course. And like we started with Williams. The theme in a way was trying to see how people picked up on him, how people critiqued him. We went through Rodney, Sylvia Federici, Sidney Mintz trio. We came straight up to Baptist and Walter Johnson, the new historians of capitalism. It was a great course. But yeah, I mean, this was a graduate level course, but there's a lot of interest we could do that with.
Yeah, and as you said earlier too, Harvey, just thinking about the literary aspects to it, being able to sort of address that in a course. Meleisa, sorry, you have a...
I've not taught this book in detail, and but I think that what's wonderful about Williams, and actually, Matthew, what you sort of picked up about his writing, the way he writes, and the sort of forcefulness that he writes. I mean, it's very much about, I think, about the politics of history writing. And you know, like he was it in '66 that he wrote that book about British historians and the writing of the West Indies, right? Which, and again, it's like, so the content is one thing, but actually the politics of what we do as historians, I think, is another thing that comes out really strongly in that book. And so I think that this, you know, if you're teaching this book, especially at graduate level, especially to students who are going to go off, you know, and become themselves academic historians, that is something that is really important, that we should be thinking about, really, you know, the position that we're in and how we're actually doing the history that we're doing, not just the content of what we're doing.
That's a very good point. Yes, the quality of his writing and the statements he makes and how he does it. That's a consistency, actually, we find through his early articles, Capitalism and Slavery, through his political speeches when he became prime minister. Very, very strong thread there. On this point about Williams and his political career and the book, Henrika Alting, thanks Henrika for this question, is asking, how much has Williams' later political career affected how people responded to the book? Harvey?
I was going to say, I feel like that's a Heather question.
Heather?
Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough. Interesting question. I must admit, when I teach capitalism and slavery, I tell my students, forget your politics. It's not about that, and that's how I start. But I do think the interesting thing about capitalism and slavery is that the response to it changes with time. And I do think in the heights of Williams' career, a lot of the negativity with which the book was greeted was related to Williams and his politics. I must add, though, a lot of support came because of his politics. For example, the labor movement. There's always been strong support for capitalism and slavery. I think over time, as this has become about much more than Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, and there is actually an international demand for the ideas in the book, I think the book has gained support. And I think you would find both government, opposition, everyone saying, it is a good book. Talking about Eric Williams, there's still a lot of controversy there, but respect to capitalism and slavery, I think it's a good book that we in Trinidad and Tobago are proud of. I mean, understand too that even a lot of the controversial things about the author is what makes it such a great book. That is why he writes with such power and authority, and that's why he's one who would drop the mic. So I think over time there has been a reckoning in the Caribbean, and I think there's an acceptance and pride at this point.
Great.
And there's a feeling too that something was said that needed to be said, you know, and about the Caribbean and understanding about our past and the role it played. I think that is very much appreciated.
Thanks, Heather. Question here from Simon Newman. As UK universities and other institutions like the Church of England address reparative justice, albeit slowly and tentatively, the Williams thesis and work like Stephen's building on Williams is becoming a battleground once again. What work do we need to do, new research and publications, to strengthen and expand the Williams thesis to support the case for reparative justice? Thanks, Simon, and good to see you online. Let me start with you, Stephen, in response to Simon's question.
Thank you, Simon, for the question. I still think there's a widespread misunderstanding of the Williams thesis, plural. And I think it's quite easy with some people with an agenda in British academia today say, well, the Williams thesis is written off, it's been, it's over. They're misinterpreting the decline thesis with the wider argument about industrialization, which to me, there's very many prominent historians, economic historians today in the UK, like Draper, Maxine Berg, Pat Hudson. Their book has just been released. Noah Zahedi, Sherwin Haggerty, Tom Devine. It seems to me that the Williams thesis and industrialization is not only alive and well, but we're reaching orthodoxy. And I think a major statement would be an edited collection, perhaps by the RHS, somebody with a prominence like that, a major edited collection, the most prominent economic historians, for just a revisitation of the Williams thesis. I won't mention the book that's been published in the last wee while by a non-historian who writes off the Williams thesis. He misunderstands it. He uses historiography that's 20 years out of date, so an up-to-date, survey of the Williams thesis and industrialization and the various by a prominent publisher could help with that. And of course, we're at an imperial reckoning at the moment in many British institutions, Church of Scotland, Church of England, as Simon mentioned, banks, universities. So of course the thesis is alive and well for historians and wider British society.
I wonder, Stephen, thinking of your answer there and thinking back to something that Harvey said in the first part of our discussion, if this misunderstanding, which seems to run through a lot of the ways in which this book is received in different places, is itself to face its own reckoning? Is there a way in which we are not actually thinking and engaging with aspects of the book, as Heather said, in the way that Williams intended, and that the book becomes sort of, and the arguments within it, sort of part of arguments that are not tied to exactly what Williams is talking about? I wonder if anyone has a thought on that.
So I have a thought, and it's, I think, a central misunderstanding of the book, I think, is this argument around the incompatibility between capitalism and slavery. People take that to be the argument. I think if you read it properly, that's absolutely not the argument, right? Because if you read it closely, he's saying the capitalists in England were for abolishing slavery in the West Indies, but they were quite happy with it in Cuba and Brazil, right? So there is no incompatibility. I think the frightening part of that argument is about the convenience. I think what Williams is really saying is that capitalists would do anything that is convenient. And I think that's a really powerful argument, even thinking about reparations in some sense, because it might be saying, don't look back. We don't have to constantly look back at slavery and think about repairing that. But if you took Williams' point, it would be, we look at capitalism and look at the fact that it is so amoral, it will do anything that's like convenient to it. So in a way, it would force us to watch the present. So I feel like if we saw that the argument wasn't about incompatibility or mechanical, but it was really an argument about the amorality of capitalism, we would actually use the book as a way to look at politics today.
Good. I think that would be very much in keeping with something Williams says in the book as well, about this is not about British capitalism and slavery itself, it's about the system of capitalism. Sorry, who wanted, was that Heather's voice?
I wanted to just make two quick points with respect to the use of capitalism and slavery and the reparation movement. I think the information is there. I think coming from the grounding of Williams, research is being done in several areas, and I think that is providing data and information. I think that drilling down with respect to specifics of different islands, etc., that work has to be done, and I think that is being done. But the other thing I want to say honestly is that I don't think Capitalism and Slavery is an easy book to read and understand in all its complexities. It is something that even if I pick it up today and read it again, I see new things. And I think what has to happen is that we have to find a way to present the information in a form that is easily understood and appreciated. So that the ideas in Williams, people can more easily identify with them, understand them, and apply it to the reparations context. I think that has to happen.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to go to another question now from the audience. This is from Sean Smith. The argument from Williams' first chapter that slavery produced racism rather than racism being a precondition for slavery gets overlooked relative to the more economic arguments. Could the panelists speak to the persistence of the argument and its continuing role in the historiography? Anyone wants to pick this one up? Meleisa? Sorry.
Unmute, Meleisa.
Oh.
Okay.
Sorry, Matthew, can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's Williams' argument early in the book that slavery produced racism and not the other way around. And Sean Smith is asking if this argument, which has often been overlooked in favor of the economic arguments of the book, is something that should be discussed more in talking about the book's relevance to historiography.
I mean, I think that the discussion that Harvey, what Harvey was saying about this book being a book about sort of the immorality of capitalism is central to this, right? That this is not just about race. This is not like slavery is not just about race. This is about something larger than that, I think is really important. And I mean, this question has been, I mean, this was quite hotly debated, I think, in the 60s, right? Especially in the 60s. And I'm thinking about people like Carl Degler and, you know, sort of these debates about what came first, the chicken or the egg debate. And I mean, I suppose it is something that we need to think about. I think the more difficult question for us when we're thinking about racism is its intrinsic link with capitalism. I think that is something that we have a harder time dealing with as a society. And so, I mean, I think that is something that we should be discussing.
Yeah. Shameless plug, Matt, but I just wrote a review of Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black, which is a book that challenges Williams in that way. It totally goes on to Melissa's point about Carl Degler. It takes up the argument, and it's a deeply problematic argument to me. And I'd say the danger in not paying attention to the Williams argument about slavery producing racism is that it tends to produce like this natural idea of race, right? So I think Williams is pointing out the need to think more about the historical construction of race. And people who argued against them, I think they tend toward the naturalization of race and making it seem that there is something in the Black body that innately made them like attractive to be enslaved almost. And that's I think is a very ahistorical approach. So I agree with Sean's question though, that we should.
Can I say, just to add to that, I think that the other reason that we kind of were quite reluctant to sort of delve deeper into this. Actually, I mean, there is a lot of work on the history of race, right? And the history of anti-Black racism, especially. But I think it's really uncomfortable because it does actually force us to see how complicit we all potentially could be in this, right? And its perpetuation. And I think that makes it a really difficult thing. It's much easier to say it's, with very specific people sort of engaging with Africans in a very specific way, and that's just sort of a natural thing, and it's not the case at all.
Thanks for that. I think it might be fair to also point out that Williams, coming back to Harvey's earlier point, I mean, he's making very strong arguments here, and he wants to point out some of the incongruities around questions and arguments about race that were very contemporary at the time he's writing, but it's not going to be a book that's going to sort of go into a deep discussion on that, though he's absolutely aware, and again, his background cannot be divorced from this, of the role of Black people in Britain and how they're treated here in Britain. And this again comes out very, very subtly sometimes, but more powerfully at others in the book, in which he refers to the sale of Black persons in Britain, in which he refers to iconography that is prejudicial against Africans that was around in Britain in the 18th century. He's absolutely aware of this, and he wants to sort of connect it very clearly back to questions of capital and slavery. We have not too many minutes, and I'm going to try and get a few more questions in. But before there's a very useful comment that Paul Sutton has made here for us. In 1980, I worked directly with Eric Williams to produce a 500-page book of his selected speeches and some writings. In the speeches, his developing ideas on the role of history and politics is clearly set out, and he thought capitalism and slavery needed no revision. So that addresses an earlier question that we had before. Kelly F has 3 questions, and Kelly, if you don't mind, I'm going to only take 2 of you 3 in the interest of time. Was there any interaction between Williams and Aimé Césaire from Martinique? I don't know of any, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were. They were all part of a Caribbean intellectual milieu of the 1940s, and Williams as a statesman quite likely would have been in spaces that Césaire might have been in. We do know that Williams did have interactions with Haitian intellectuals of that same generation, and of course he was very well known to intellectuals in Jamaica in the 50s and 60s. So it's not inconceivable that he would have interacted with Césaire. And the second question, was there any collaboration between Williams, Black Americans, and African leaders, artists, etc., during that time or later on? Harvey, any thoughts on that one? Do you know of any intersections with Williams and African American?
I mean, there's the the Negro Oxford thing, right? There's Williams at Howard. And I think it's in Heather's, the volume that you edited with Selwyn Carrington, but John Hope Franklin writes a really nice chapter in Williams's time at Howard, right? And he's collaborating with E. Franklin Fraser. Like it's a chapter that gives a good sense of Williams's time at Howard. And there's a lot of collaboration. I mean, it's an interesting piece in the way that it talks about how Williams avoids the kind of academic politics of Howard, but yeah, he's kind of active. The Negro in the Caribbean is a product of his collaboration, I think, with
the Anglo-American Commission.
Right, and Elaine Locke is part of that.
And Elaine Locke, yeah.
Just
Great,
want to
thanks.
add quickly, Matthew, that Williams was so much into the intellectual environment with Black intellectuals at Howard that he dubbed Howard the Negro Oxford.
Right.
He felt that strongly about the Black intellectual environment that he was a part of.
Good. Thanks. And it might be useful also to mention the role of University of Woodford Square when he went back to Trinidad, in which he broke down many of these arguments, not only those made in Capitalism and Slavery by himself, but other Black intellectuals for a very popular audience in Trinidad at the time, which was very, very pivotal in expanding his political fame there. A few more quick questions here as we're nearing the end. Maxine Berg, could you say something about the part played by Erica Williams Connell in keeping Williams' legacy central, and also Barbara Solow in going against the grain of most economic historians through the 1980s, especially? Stephen, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, well, I can speak personally. I've met Erica over the last few years. I met her in Liverpool at the major conference in Williams. It was hosted in conjunction with Monticello. She's done a remarkable job of, just preserving Eric's memory, as well as the library at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. She's been absolutely instrumental and done a fantastic job in that.
Great, thanks. And I'll take one more question that I will pose to the whole panel. I noticed that the introduction to the 1964 London edition of Capitalism and Slavery was written by D.W. Brogan, not the most obvious choice. Perhaps did Brogan's intervention help to give leverage to Williams' book? I think that's a good question. Harvey?
Yeah, that's a great question that I haven't thought about. I read it. All my memories of him describing Williams as a Negro radical, but yeah, I don't know anything about Brogan. Is he at Oxford or something?
It was his tutor. Brogan was his tutor.
Yeah, no, so I'll pass that on to you, Stephen.
Yeah, well, I just think it seems to me that seemed to be just a thank you from Eric, and he does say in the book, he says it's unusual for me to write a book here, and Eric's already the Prime Minister, and I think he's aware of his own his position relative to the standing of Williams and the global scene by that point. But it seems to me that if you read Inward Hunger, it doesn't have a lot of fun memories about different stuff happening at Oxford, but it seemed to me that was a statement.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that edition, by the way, that Roger Richardson mentions is the one that I recall first holding in my hands. My very first edition of Capitalism and Slavery was a used copy of that 1964 edition, which started me on my own journey of trying to collect various editions of the book. Something I asked students if they ever come across one to share with me, and a student found an African press edition of the book that was titled Slavery and Capitalism, and not Slavery and Capitalism and Slavery, which I found quite unique. Stephen, what's that?
Here's my moment. I have a Russell and Russell signed edition with a telegram from Port of Spain. So he's sending it to Nassau in the Bahamas. So I bought this for about 100 quid when I was doing a PhD, and I never realised how rare it was at that point. But I mean, it's became a prized possession.
Yeah, well, that's as fine as any note to end on. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you to everyone on the panel, Stephen, Meleisa, Heather, and Harvey. This has been a fantastic discussion. And thanks to you, the audience, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you so much to the panel for such a really fascinating discussion. So I am myself a historian of the British Industrial Revolution. So of course, one of these books I know really well. And I've just found it so inspiring that we're all sitting here thinking and talking about a book that didn't get a lot of attention in its own time, and yet still just contains so much for us to think about and ponder. And just such a thanks to our panel for really just sharing that kind of the importance of the book and just providing such a new perspective. I'm sure many in the audience are feeling exactly the same way as I am. Well, look, it's here in Britain, it's absolutely beautifully warm. It's a lovely summer's evening. Before we close and people can get out and enjoy this lovely, lovely weather, I'd just like to say a word about our next event, which is the Prothero Lecture, which is taking place on Wednesday, the 5th of July. Our speaker is Brenda Stevenson, who is the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair of Women's History at St. John's College, and her lecture is entitled To Do and Be Undone, Enslaved Black Life, Courtship and Marriage in the Antebellum South. So I think that may be of interest to many of the people who've wanted to listen to today's panel discussion. It's an in-person lecture at UCL starting at 5 o'clock, as I say, on the 5th of July. We'll be broadcasting it by Zoom and releasing a recording afterwards. But following the lecture, from 6:30 p.m, we are also holding our annual summer party at UCL, and the lecture and the party are open to all. So if you can get to London on the 5th of July, please come and join us. If not, keep an eye on our website. We're doing a great many other things that you can get involved in. And with that, I'll close this event. Thank you very much to our panel, and wherever you are, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.